Another state just passed regulation. This time it's Washington State, and this new law is perhaps the most damaging regulation to wholesalers so far. This is different than anything we've seen so far. Now I'm going to break it down for you on this video, but stay to the end because there might be one loophole that could be the saving grace for wholesalers. All of that and more coming up. If you're new here, I'm the nation's leading expert on wholesaling and flipping, and I've taken it upon myself to become the wholesaling industry's voice on not just how to operate with transparency and integrity, but also how to educate you on what the new regulations are as they become laws in all the various states, and also what they mean and how to comply, as well as how to adapt. I maintain a free report with all of these different regulations. Just go to wholesaleregulations.com to get that free download. Okay, let's talk about Washington State. In the name of protecting the consumer, how in the world did HB 1081 get signed into law? Honestly, nothing surprises me anymore. The creativity with these new regulations is mind-boggling. Beginning January 1, 2026, this new law applies to all buyers who actively solicit the purchase of real property that is not currently for sale on the open market. Let's pause there. There's a lot to unpack. First, this law only applies to off-market or direct-to-seller properties. It does not apply if the property is publicly listed for sale. Second, it applies to all buyers, not just wholesalers. It applies to fix and flippers and buy and hold investors. It even applies if you're a retail buyer. 3, this applies to buyers that actively solicit the seller. Now, at first, I assumed that would apply to outbound marketing, where you reach out to the seller, and that it would not apply to inbound marketing, where the seller reaches out to you, but I don't think that's what it means. The law specifically says what it means to actively solicit sellers to include public advertising or written, electronic, or in-person contact. So any public advertising that is online, written, or in person. Well, that would be Google or social media ads, TV and radio. That would include direct mail, and in-person would be door knocking. Seems to me that actively soliciting sellers, as the law is written, includes all forms of marketing, regardless if it's outbound or inbound. Okay, so what happens if a buyer solicits a seller on an unlisted property? There are 5 things that happen in that situation. First, the seller has the right to an appraisal by a licensed appraiser of their choice. Second, if they elect to get the appraisal, they have 3 days from executing the purchase contract to order it. Third, and here's the kicker, the buyer has to pay for it. Yeah, that's right. The buyer has to pay for the seller's appraisal. This is insane. It gets worse. Fourth, after the owner receives the appraisal that the buyer paid for, mind you, he has the right to cancel the contract within 4 days without penalty and without further obligation. You pay for the appraisal that he uses against you. And fifth, these sellers' rights must be clearly stated in writing in the purchase contract in boldface font, and the seller must acknowledge them in writing. So let me get this straight. When a buyer contracts with a seller on an unlisted property, that seller has 3 days to order an appraisal at the buyer's expense, and then after receiving the appraisal, the seller has 4 days to cancel the contract without penalty. Yep, welcome to the great state of Washington. That's insane, and even though this law is for all buyers, let's be real, it's clearly directed at wholesalers and will have a huge negative impact on the wholesaling industry. I mean, an appraisal costs like $500. I'm supposed to pay $500 with no guarantee the seller will move forward. Who would do that? And get this, if the seller decides to skip getting the appraisal, he still has 10 business days post signing the contract to cancel for any reason without penalty. So he can take your contract and shop it to the next highest paying buyer he can find. What's the point of the contract? How is this a law? And I found this to be hilarious. Here are the different ways outlined in the law that the seller can notify you that they are exercising their right to cancel. They can notify you by email. That seems logical. They can notify you by mail. That's reasonable. Or, this is important, pay attention, they can notify you by telegram. That's right, it says in the law, by telegram. Now, if you were born after 1920, you may not know what a telegram is. So let's turn to ChatGPT. What is a telegram? Telegrams were a primary means of long-distance communication before the widespread adaptation of telephones. Telegrams were sent using telegraph lines, which carried electronic signals to transmit the message. The messages were often handwritten at the receiving end and delivered to the recipient. Due to the cost of sending telegrams, messages were often brief and used abbreviations or shortened words. So if you got a telegram from the seller, which I doubt you will because India was the last country to discontinue using telegrams in 2013. But if for some reason you get a telegram, it might say something like this: F you, me no sell house. But don't worry, the Consumer Protection Agency in Washington, in all their wisdom, thought this through. If a seller wants to cancel and doesn't have email, snail mail, or access to a telegram service, the law states he can notify you by, quote, any other written communication. Now, I wonder what else he could do. Can't send a smoke signal because it has to be handwritten. Maybe he could send a pigeon. ChatGPT, do people still use pigeons to send messages? Pigeons are no longer used for large-scale communication. The last pigeon post service in the world was in India and closed in 2008. Dang it. Oh, I know. ChatGPT, what about the Pony Express? No, the Pony Express is not currently used for everyday mail delivery. It became obsolete by the completion of the Transcontinental Telegraph Line in 1861. So back to sending telegram messages. Now, how in the world did this law come to be? Well, I got a pretty good idea. There is one exception to this law that tells us everything. It does not apply to a seller or a buyer represented by a real estate agent licensed in the state of Washington. Aha, now it makes sense. The National Association of Realtors is behind this. Genius. Let's pass a law that makes it really difficult for off-market transactions as a way to force wholesalers and investors to get licensed or hire licensed agents. Make everyone use agents. What a sneaky way for agents to get their grubby little fingers in the private sector. As terrible as it is, I gotta hand it to NAR, it's brilliant. And that brings me to the only possible workaround for wholesalers and investors that I can see, and that's to get a real estate license or align with a buyer's agent who can, quote, represent you. I mean, it clearly states that this does not apply to a seller or a buyer represented by a real estate agent licensed in the state of Washington. That means if you have an active Washington real estate license, I don't see why you can't self-represent yourself in the transaction, or get someone on your team to get a license and represent you, or align with someone you know who's licensed to represent you. Somehow get buyer representation, and this law does not apply. I really hope that's the case. Otherwise, who in their right mind is going to lock up deals for weeks on end, open escrow, pay for an appraisal, find and contract with cash buyers just to have sellers back out? That would be really dumb to take that kind of risk. Now, as of this recording, you have about 6 months. Like I said, this goes into effect January 1st, 2026. So I recommend you get your real estate license. If and when you do, consider joining my agent team at Real Brokerage. Not only are we investor friendly, but Real doesn't require paying commissions on wholesale transactions. Joke's on you, NAR. Besides, as an active real estate investor, my license pays me 10 times over. So watch this next video where I explain 8 ways investors can make money with a real estate license. Watch that now, and I'll see you on the next video.